We all know the death care market is changing, so why are you sticking to the same old marketing strategies? Inertia Marketing and Design knows death care and handles the marketing needs for hundreds of cemeteries, funeral homes, and industry suppliers. From email campaigns, websites, and social media presences to printed materials, promotions, branding, and public relations, Inertia is your turnkey solution to elevate your brand and reach your customer base. Find Inertia online at www.inertia.marketing or call death care marketing expert John Novickis at 888-552-IDEA, extension 113. That's 888-552-4332, extension 113. Inertia Marketing and Design. Brands in motion, stay in motion. Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is Funeral Service Insider from Kates-Boylston, featuring conversations about emerging trends and news that affect the death care industry. We talk to people who understand the delicate balance of change in a profession and vocation steeped in tradition. In this episode, we're talking to Doak Marasco. He's the manager of strategic partnerships for Davey. He was featured in the May edition of American Funeral Director for some of his tips on how cemeteries should begin thinking about climate change and how it's going to affect the way that they do business and the way they do groundskeeping going well into the future. It was a super fascinating conversation. We talked about turf and about woody plants and about invasive species and even natural species that are changing and making their way into different places because climate change is letting them. And what's interesting about this episode, even if you're not a cemeterian, is this idea that it's time to rethink how we do lawns and gardens and trees, and to begin to accommodate either the fact that you're going to have a lot more water or a lot less water in the next decade or so. This week, we're also offering a promo code to save on registration for our upcoming funeral service business plan. We'll give you a discount code during the show, so you'll have to listen all the way through. And also, as always, please remember to stick around for the postmortem after the closing credits, where I wrap it up with an interesting story from funeral service. All right, that'll do it for me now, and let's get to this conversation with Doak. So in the May edition of American Cemetery, there was this great article about how climate change is affecting cemeteries. And it was something that kind of caught me from left field because, yes, of course, they have to, but I didn't really understand how deeply it was affecting cemeteries. And so I figured I'd call you and get you to elaborate because the story was so great. Can you give me like a big picture idea about how climate change is already affecting cemeteries and how you think it'll continue to affect them in the long term?
Sure. Climate change, global warming, impacting cemeteries, landscapes across the country through a number of different challenges that they present, from increasing temperatures, which are leading to more intense storms, more frequent storms. One of the big themes I think that I'd like to share today is too much water, too little water. That's going to be one of the biggest challenges for anybody managing landscapes going into the future, certainly this next century, from increased pest and disease threats resulting from ultimately stress that's being placed on plants in the landscape. It's a lot. It's going to be something that anybody that considers themselves a steward of the landscape, setting their sites up for thinking about sustainability, resiliency, health, and safety, are going to have to plan for and implement best management practices to ensure that their landscapes are there for future generations.
I was particularly interested in the stormwater management because of this notion, like everybody knows that it's bad when you don't get any rain and things get dried out, and how are you going to deal with finding water? But, it never occurred to me that too much rain can be so damaging to cemeteries, especially like extended humidity, because it goes beyond even just the turf management, but turf management's a real problem.
Certainly, Tony. Too much rain, too much moisture affects plants in a number of ways. Plants have adapted over hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. You think of ginkgo trees that were present here today and were around back at the time of the dinosaurs. So plants have adapted over a long period of time. And when you have too much moisture in the landscape, for those that aren't adapted to wet climates, it can be detrimental. And also from the standpoint of the increased storm intensity that I talked about, oversaturated soils, and you introduce wind pressure, and then canopies that are fully leafed out, soils oversaturated. And what we're seeing more and more of is healthy, mature trees toppling over due to oversaturation in the soil.
This is going to be me revealing my ignorance, so I apologize to our cemeterian listeners who may already know that this is a dumb question. But how often are you should a cemetery be kind of evaluating their stormwater management plan, because the old one may not be working anymore, and you may have to find new ways to get water out into, if not the street, into ponds, into water features, out of the soil a little bit more quickly. Is that something that you're seeing people starting to change their stormwater management plans more often than they did, even a decade ago?
Sure. And with a cemetery, with a memorial park, if there is a plan, a landscape management plan at all, typically, at least historically, you wouldn't see a stormwater management component of a plan. So that's something that we want to increasingly think about and include in our management plans. But trees, woody plants in general do a fantastic job of mitigating the effects of stormwater runoff by intercepting rain as it falls from the sky and buffering it from hitting the ground and running off. And then, of course, absorbing the moisture in through the soil, and then through evapotranspiration, returning that moisture back out into the environment. But trees themselves are, if we think of trees and woody plants as green infrastructure, that's really what they are. So we have to move away from thinking of plants, the aesthetic component of it, is them just being an amenity to really green infrastructure.
And how can you start to do that, especially if you've got a cemetery with like well established plants that you've mostly been treating as ornamentals?
Sure. And I would, there's a few things I would do. The first thing I would do is I would conduct a complete inventory or assessment of the cemetery to determine what plant material that you currently have. Without having that baseline, it's really hard to make informed management decisions for the long term. So that would be step number one. Step number two, and perhaps a component of that inventory, I would strongly encourage implementing a monitoring program to, 3, 4, 5 times a year, have a certified arborist, someone that understands, what to look for in the landscape. Just walk and talk, with the superintendent or the cemetery manager through the landscape, and just describe what it is that you're seeing, to then forecast, what threats you can anticipate, what threats are currently present from pests and diseases. Certainly, more of an environmental type of assessment from how water is managed in the landscape. Where do you have too much? Where do you have not enough? Is stormwater runoff an issue? That can carry, pollutants like oil and debris into your waterways on your property and then off your property as well too. So those are just a couple steps that I would recommend implementing as a baseline.
I'm going to change gears here really quick, because you mentioned something earlier on, and I don't want to let it go before we get too far. You have new pests and you have new plants. One of the things that was really interesting in the story was this idea of plant migration. Just new things are showing up that need to be accommodated, and they're not non-native species, but they're also not really native species. And this managing new plants as they emerge, and then the pests and even friendly bugs that come with them, is something that people have to start to do more actively. Because in my own backyard, there are new birds. And when I check, I'm like, yeah, they belong here, but I've never seen them before. That's happening more obviously now, I think, than, again, maybe even a decade ago.
Sure. there's a movement presently that's been in place for a number of years, this drive towards reintroducing native species back into the landscape. We brought in a lot of various non-native exotic species for largely beautification purposes. We enjoyed their flowers or their form, their characteristics about them that made the landscape perhaps more interesting. And so there's a shift back towards planting native species, in part because native species are adapted to not only the conditions that we have here, which are changing and changing fairly rapidly, but they're also adapted to the pests and disease that are here. So having a broad palette of native species, I think, is a very positive thing. But I would also caution that we have lots of non-native species as well, referring to plants here specifically, that are quite hardy within the landscape. Certainly in urban environments, when we think about trees that are, along city streets, you tend to see a lot of non-native species, or even species that are native but are a variety of that species that has proven could be cold hardy or drought tolerant, for example. So I think that the key here is increasing biodiversity, and you have to understand when you're managing potentially thousands of trees in the landscape, you're looking for not only how rich is your palette of species, but the species composition itself. You don't want everything to be. You don't want to have 10 different maples and one type of oak. You want to really diversify your palette as much as possible.
And that's also that protects against pests. You don't want everybody gets sick at once and dies. You're going to have you have a mess on your hands.
Absolutely. Planting a monoculture of species, and again, I'm going to go back to the maples where I'm at presently in the Northeast. You have a pest like Asian longhorn beetle come in where maples are the preferred host. And just as you spoke to, you have a real significant challenge on your hands when you've got a pest that favors a particular species and you don't have a diverse landscape that's resilient enough to carry forward if you were to lose those species.
One of the other things that you mentioned in the story that I wanted to talk about, and you touched on it a couple seconds ago, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about it a little bit more, is how to be proactive as these storms are getting worse. How to kind of train your staff to make sure they're constantly looking for potential issues so that you can kind of hedge your bets should a storm sweep in. They say we're going to have a for real hurricane season this year, so I think that's pretty relevant.
Sure. So one of the things that I advise in terms of thinking about hurricane season is that we focus on mitigating risk within a landscape. That's something that to have a qualified, certified arborist go out and assess, especially mature trees, that when they fail or they have defects and they fail, that they cause as minimal amount of damage as possible. And one of the only options in some cases for really mitigating risk is to remove a tree that has defects with a high likelihood of failure. When it comes to assessing trees, there's quite a bit of training involved in, any one of us can take a look at a tree and see a cavity in it and say that tree's got decay in there, it should come down. But the fact is that's not always the case. Where is the decay located? How extensive is it? What are the things that we're seeing? There are signs like certain decay fungi that tell us, that give us a better picture of how much decay is in the tree and the type of decay. And then there are also tools today that allow you to examine or get a better sense of how much is within the tree, such as a sonic tomography, which sends sound waves through the tree and then prints out a digital image of where the weak spots are within a tree. So that we have these tools available to us. But back to just walking the grounds, I always strongly encourage that whether you have an arborist that you work with, a certified arborist, anybody has the ability to walk the grounds and see something, whether it's flagging in the canopy, yellowing of leaves, or decay within the trunk of the tree, and you're just not sure what the likelihood of failure is. based on your own personal observations. We can all see something, and we should all have, in my personal opinion, an arborist that we're comfortable with, that we can reach out to give us a better picture of what the likelihood of failure is and what's at stake there.
All right, we're going to take a second to speak with Lucia Igani, our Director of Marketing, and she's going to tell us about an upcoming in-person event, the Funeral Service Business Plan. Lucia, tell us a little bit about who's coming and what the dates are and all that.
The dates are October 24th and 25th, and it's in Virginia Beach at the Delta Hotels by Marriott. Beautiful location right on the beach. It's a 2-day event. We have a panel of 9 expert speakers.
We're offering a promo code. This is the first time we're doing this. I'm pretty excited about it. I feel like a podcasting hotshot. But we are offering a promo code for listeners only. It is the lowest price that you will be able to get for the show. And what is the price and what is the promo code?
That is correct. So right now we're running a super early bird rate of $347. But for our listeners, we're offering the promo code with another $50 savings, bringing the ticket price to $297. And the promo code for that is FSI Podcast.
That is FSI Podcast, like Funeral Service Insider Podcast. FSI Podcast. Put that in a checkout and you'll get the additional $50 off the already reduced early bird rate. And that's available till August 27th?
August 27th. And if you'd like to learn more information about this upcoming event, visit our website. Under the events section, you'll see all the information you need with the speaker information as well as the agenda. You will also have a link there to register for the conference through Eventbrite.
And the link will be in the show notes. And can you tell me about some of the speakers?
We have Tyler Anderson. He's the Vice President of Business Development for Precoa. His session is titled Unlocking Pre-Need, How to Leverage Pre-Need to Increase Case Volume and Average Funeral Value.
Very cool. And then let me again follow up with the fair $50 off. Don't forget to use the code FSI Podcast. And I guess that's all we have for this week. Thank you so much, Lucia.
Thanks, Tony.
When you have an arborist come out, when one has an arborist come out, does it make sense to have a couple of staff people walk along with them, or is that just getting underfoot?
No, I believe it is. I think it's a learning opportunity. And who's a better resource than the staff that's in the field every day, walking the grounds? And it could be the mowing crew. We can get them more engaged with looking at, and turf is a whole other thing that we need to be aware of in terms of climate change too. It's not just the woody plants, but to engage our grounds crew and being able to learn, that create that learning opportunity, create that buy-in, that stewardship of the landscape, I think is very important, and perhaps a missed opportunity if we're not doing that.
So as long as you brought it up, let's follow through with turf. So what are the kinds of things people should be keeping their eyes out? Just walking the grounds for turf, what kind of experts should you have come in and take a look to see where you stand?
Sure. So experts that are familiar with it's very similar to woody plants, but the pests and diseases that impact turf, water requirements, nutrient requirements, many different types of grasses grown across the country. I mean, we're seeing southern species of grasses like Bermuda grass now moving into cemeteries in New York City and even further north now, that because of warming temperatures, these grasses can now survive in northern climates. But just individuals that understand the needs of grasses, of turf, from mowing heights to soil conditions, such as applying lime to increase nutrient availability. It's almost as complex as, I would say it's as complex as woody plants.
Along those lines, once you have an invasive, especially, I mean, again, I just know from my own backyard, once you have an invasive or a different grass, even, it doesn't need necessarily be invasive, but it sticks out. And dealing with that over acres and acres and acres can be, I guess, a real problem. Is there a way to deal with them once they come in, or is it something that you just have to learn how to incorporate for example, Bermuda grass, into your overall landscaping plan?
These grasses, as they move forward and establish, and whether it's grasses that we accept in landscape, I mean, weeds is, weeds are, what is a weed? It's
Yeah.
really relatively subjective. So do we accept that? What is our tolerance for dandelions in the landscape? For clover in the landscape, do we see those things as weeds? And I think that varies from site to site, from cemetery to memorial park and beyond as to what our take is. I do believe that learning to live with some plants that we would typically consider to be weeds is something that is, we have drier weather that thins out the turf grass, that creates an environment where weeds like crabgrass that thrive in hot, dry climates come in. Perhaps that's something we have to become more acceptable of and more tolerant of. The other side to that is that we're continually placing down herbicides to remove weeds, so it's more and more chemical product. And so we're just trying to create the most favorable environment that we can for turf so that it can outcompete weeds. I would offer that where possible, and I'm seeing this from cemetery to cemetery increasingly lately, is where can we replace turf entirely? Can we install some planting beds? I'm a big advocate of mulch. Certainly under trees where it's just tough to grow turf to begin with. Removing turf where it makes sense to, and putting down mulch instead. Grass is highly intensive, requires a lot of water and a lot of care, a lot of maintenance. We're still using gas-powered equipment in many cases, which then, so we're creating this cycle that seems to, it just seems to kind of exacerbate the problem where we're releasing more emissions, the climate's warming, it's creating more stress on plants. So removing turf may be an option. And I know that's difficult in a cemetery or memorial park type of landscape, but just thinking about those type of alternatives, that some of the cemeteries, some large historical rural garden cemeteries are looking at where can we replace turf? Can we put in pollinator habitat, which, there's a movement for increasing pollinator plants that are have bloom times, different flowering plants that bloom throughout the season. So stratifying bloom times to make a fantastic habitat for bees and butterflies and so on. I'm seeing it not just in cemeteries. I'm seeing it in residential homeowner landscapes. So there's a movement there for that, and I think that also resonates with the consumers that are looking to come to the cemetery as well.
And that's actually how the story started, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because, as many of us know, the cemeteries, what has become the modern cemetery was really half park, half cemetery for much of the 1800s and after the turn of the century, and we have a lot of these now. Many cemeteries are these large expanses that are mostly open and don't have a lot of features. And so bringing in features, maybe trees are not something you're going to be able to bring into some, cemeteries, but bringing in these different features and making it more of a park feel, going back toward this public place for people to come and contemplate, and not, I don't want to say merely, but not only a place where you come to visit your own family or loved ones.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to necessarily be trees. We have this connection to nature that goes back to the very beginning, to inception for our species. And I think that these landscapes, that cemeteries, parks that incorporate plants of a whole range of different types, it creates a peaceful, tranquil environment that is very conducive towards the grieving process. This place of solace that we can go and reflect and memorialize our loved ones. There is a connection there. It's very strong. We're seeing it right now in the industry, and I've mentioned this groove movement, this green movement, but as it relates to cemeteries, it makes me think of all the different options that are becoming available out there, from natural organic reduction to scattering gardens and so forth, that really do tie back to nature. And as the consumer wants options that fulfill that connection, I think that landscapes within cemeteries and parks, trees, turf, water features, stone walls, natural elements are really important for bringing individuals back to the cemetery. Certainly, with rising cremation rates, how do you bring cremains back to a cemetery from the funeral home to the cemetery? And I think nature is a big part of that puzzle.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. We just, so the episode of the podcast that aired at the beginning of July was about columbarium and how to make, and how to make people come back to the cemetery. So it's fresh in everybody's mind as they're listening to it now. So practically speaking, one knows they have to turn around their cemetery. They've got a lot of work to do. What's a good way to kind of go about budgeting and planning in the very long term, and then the medium range and the short term? How do you kind of put together what's an emergency and what will be an emergency in 10 years, and how can we deal with it now?
Right. It goes back to that initial, what I might call an environmental assessment, thinking about climate resiliency and sustainability, is starting with knowing what you have in the landscape. So going out and cataloging the different trees and shrubs that are present, the types of turf that you have, and really thinking about where you're at within the country or beyond, what the climate conditions are going to look like for you in the next 100 years. What is that forecast? Across the country, moisture is going to be variable across the country, but in the Southeast, it's forecasted to be much wetter than it presently has within the last 100 years. If you move up into the Northeast, the Midwest, it's going to get a little bit drier, longer growing season, drought in the summer, but a lot of moisture in the winter. And then, of course, as you move out west into the Southwest, for example, it will continue to get drier and hotter. If you look at where you're at in the country and you perform an assessment like that, thinking about taking the climate, the changing climate and the hardiness zones in the climate where plants thrive and adapt, and understand where the forecast is taking us, then you can put together a plan that looks at what do you presently have today, what do you want to plant, thinking about tomorrow, how do you reduce a canopy that is largely a mature canopy, and planting for the future, what types of climate resilient plants. So there's these type of things that do exist out there. If you were to go to davy.com/climate, Dr. Dan Herms with the Davy Institute has lists of plants out there that are climate facing or climate resilient that you should be planting or considering for the future, because they can handle what's projected to come their way. But you need that baseline assessment to really understand what's going on out there, and to take into consideration, again, the potential pest threats and how increasing temperatures are going to impact the landscape overall.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. If you click on where you're listening now, you can be able to click through to the Davy Climate page. And that is all I have for you now, unless you have something else for me. Is there something I didn't ask and should have asked, something you thought you'd get the opportunity to say, but I didn't present it?
I enjoyed the conversation, Tony. There's certainly lots to talk about here. It's complicated. There's a lot to consider when we're thinking about the climate. We're thinking about plants. I do believe that we all have the ability to be stewards of our landscapes, and that it's incumbent upon all of us to recognize the challenges that are out there. Because if you think about a mature beech tree, or you think about a mature oak tree, to plant one of those today, we'll never see it reach maturity in our lifetime. And so it's important to take these things into consideration today for the future generations. We all have that responsibility, in my opinion. And going back to some of the basics, the things that are just so easily missed all the time, from planting trees properly to mulching, to applying proper amounts of mulch, pruning properly. These things are often undertaken by individuals that don't have the training per se. And so whether it's an internal in-house staff, I always suggest invest in your team, offer this training, bring in a certified arborist, do a tree planting demonstration, talk about where can you prune roots? Where can you dig and not impact the overall health of a tree and stress out a tree even more than the environment is already throwing our way. So there's lots of things that are culturally speaking, cultural practices, the bare basics of arboriculture that we can implement that are relatively easy to do and easy to train for, that can really help when we're talking about climate change and plants that are resilient to drought, to increased amounts of water, to pest and disease threats. So that's something that we can all be a part of, I believe.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with me.
Thank you, Tony. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, sponsored by Inertia Marketing and Design. If your funeral home, cemetery, or death care industry service is looking to get your brand into motion, Inertia Marketing and Design is your answer. Inertia handles all your marketing, online, social media, and public relations needs in one place. Discover an accelerated solution to make your brand stand out in the death care crowd. Find Inertia online at www.inertia.marketing or call death care marketing expert John Navikas at 888-552-IDEA, extension 113. That's 888-552-4332, extension 113. Inertia Marketing and Design. Brands in motion, stay in motion. Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. I've already said it, but I'll say it again. Make sure you check out the show notes, because that's where you can get in touch with us, and also it's where you can find a link to register for the Funeral Service Business Plan Conference. It's October 24th and 25th in Virginia Beach, and if you've listened this far, you already have the additional discount code, so make sure to use it. It's also the place where you can find all the contact information if you have any additional feedback. We welcome feedback via voicemail, we welcome feedback via email. All of that information is on the show notes. If you are listening to this but have not yet subscribed, please do. It's free to subscribe. Just hit the button, and then as soon as the show comes out, you'll get a notification and you can be able to listen to it right then. It is the height of August, the height of summer, the height of heat, and that means it's time to talk about dogs for this week's postmortem. So in the August edition of American Funeral Director, we have a profile of a gentleman named Jay Poster. And Mr. Poster is a funeral director at King David Memorial Chapel and Cemetery in Las Vegas, but he's also the owner of and friend of, and I guess boss of, Snickers. Full name Snickerdoodle, who is the emotional support animal at that funeral home. The story is a great story about a relationship that needed to happen between man and dog and funeral director and dog. That's one of the best parts of this whole movement, to have more support animals in funeral service. It's something that went from odd to common to almost expected, and one of the people in the story actually said they went to a funeral and there wasn't a support animal there, and that they were a little surprised. So it's something certainly, I don't need to tell you, on the rise and worth considering. And there are all sorts of ways you can go to have a funeral home dog. What I wanted to do also is mention that on our website, if you go there, you can read the story on the website, but also next to that story, there are several other stories that we ran about dogs. It's a recurring theme. I ran a story in Funeral Service Insider either late last year or early this year. I lose track of time pretty easily. It was a feature on a specific dog trainer, but one of the things that is the most interesting, and that comes out in all of the stories about it, and it's worth considering, is that just like funeral directors, dogs can get empathy exhaustion. And especially since a funeral director who owns a dog and a dog who works at a funeral home, they have the same problem that they cure one another of. or can cure one another of, can help mitigate, their relationship away from the funeral home, can mitigate their work at the funeral home. And I just think that's a special thing that we might not be thinking enough about, and I wanted to invite you to think about it. That'll be all for this episode, and we will catch you next time on Funeral Service Insider, the podcast.